Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, just a little reminder that everyone who supports this podcast in the month of September, either by joining our Patreon, where you get exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, or dropping us a one-time tip via buymeacoffee.com, no subscription required, will be receiving the complete, uninterrupted recording of the Book of Tea by Kakuzo Okakura. It's a marvelous book, and I think you'll enjoy it. If you're interested in helping to keep us 100% listener-supported and ad-free, you'll find links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the show description. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. And thank you to everyone who's already done so far. Your support makes this podcast possible, and it's really appreciated. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice, deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's return to the Book of the Ocean by Ernest Ingersoll, author of Knockin' Round the Rockies, The Oyster Industries of the United States, Friends Worth Knowing, Wild Neighbors, The Crest of the Continent, etc. Published in 1898 by the Century Company, New York. Let's pick up where we left off in the middle of Chapter 2, Waves, Tides, and Currents. The tide has been an inevitable circumstance of the existence on the earth of the ocean or any other great body of water ever since its origin. Yet it was not until Sir Isaac Newton made us comprehend the law of gravitation that its mystery was explained. We now know with certainty. If you want the mathematical formulae and so forth, consult some good modern encyclopedia under the word tide, that this periodical rising and falling of the sea is due to the attraction of the sun and moon, to the last 3 times as much as to the first, because it is so much nearer. This attraction is exerted toward the globe as a whole, and its visible effect upon the movable water is to lift it bodily on that side nearest the moon, and at the same time to pull away the earth from the water on the opposite side, which amounts to the same thing. And thus high tides are simultaneously produced at these antipodes, which accounts for the 2 a day. At the same time, however, the intermediate spaces have low tides, caused by an attraction there toward the center of the earth. There are thus always simultaneously and directly under the moon 2 high waters opposite each other, and 2 low waters at equal distances between them. Owing to the rotation of the earth, this permanent system of swells and troughs travels from east to west over every part of the ocean and of its coast, and explains the regular succession of rising and falling waters at equal intervals of time, which we call the tides. But the sun also exerts a similar but lesser influence, producing 4 daily solar tides, which most of the time are lost to view in the greater lunar tides. When, however, the moon gets into line with the earth and the sun, so that both the heavenly bodies pull together like a tandem team, as happens twice a month, at new moon and full moon, their combined action causes unusually high water, which is the sum of the lunar and solar tides, and is called the spring tide. High water is then highest, and low water lowest. On the other hand, in the midst of these fortnightly intervals, when the moon is at its first or third quarter, the sun is a full quarter of the heavens or 90 degrees away from the moon. Its influence, therefore, acts at right angles to, or practically against, that of the moon, and the solar tides go to swell the low waters and diminish the high waters, forming what sailors call neap tides, preserving an old English word meaning low. Now remember that the globe is not standing still, even while we make these explanations, but is revolving at a tremendous speed, so that the water under the moon, lifted by lunar attraction, is changing place every instant at the rate of over 1,000 miles an hour, and you have the conception of a low wave on each side of the earth reaching north and south, highest and swiftest on the equator and diminishing toward the poles. These are the true tidal waves. Were the globe covered with an unbroken mantle of water, such waves, each about 20 inches high on the average at the equator, or 29 inches high at spring tide, would follow one another round and round the earth at the rate of one complete circuit in every 24 hours. That must have been the case in the primeval ocean before any continents existed, and something of it still exists in the belt of unobstructed water surrounding the Antarctic continent of ice. It would then be flood tide or ebb tide at the same hour along the whole length of any one meridian. But in the present condition of the globe, where the oceans are separated by continents and broken by islands, the progress of the tidal waves is obstructed, deflected, and wholly stopped in a great variety of ways and places, so that the hours, amount, and behavior of the tides are exceedingly varied in different regions, and are often very puzzling, forming one of the most difficult matters with which the practical navigator has to deal. Interference of tidal currents forms the maelstrom off the coast of Norway, whose revolution is reversed twice daily, the classic Scylla and Charybdis in the Straits of Messina, so much dreaded by the navigators of old, and many other whirlpools of less celebrity. The tidal wave sweeping northward across the Atlantic has time to round the northern end of Scotland and flood the German Ocean with southward swelling currents before the rising water pouring into the southern end of the English Channel has time to push its way through that narrow and shallow passage. Hence the two floods meet in the Straits of Dover, which accounts for the miserable chop sea so sadly prevalent in that unfortunate bit of water. The natural height of the tide seems to be from 2 to 5 feet, as shown in the midst of the broad Pacific. But when dashing against the land and forced into deep gulfs and estuaries, to quote Professor Simon Newcomb, the accumulating tidewaters sometimes reach a very great height. On the eastern coast of North America, which is directly in the path of the great Atlantic wave, the tide rises on an average from 9 to 12 feet. In the Bay of Fundy, which opens its bosom to receive the full wave, the tide, which at the entrance is 18 feet, rushes with great fury into that long and narrow channel, and swells to the enormous height of 60 feet, and even to 70 feet in the highest spring tide. In the Bristol Channel on the coast of England, the spring tides rise to 40 feet, and swell to 50 in the English Channel at St. Malo on the coast of France. To this cause is also due in some degree those great oceanic currents, which form another striking fact in the history of the sea, but they are mainly due to temperature, wind, and the rotation of the earth. The drops that make up a body of water are the most restless things in the world. They are always sliding down the least slope, sinking out of the way of lighter substances, rising to let a heavier object pass beneath them, or moving hither and thither in an ever hopeful search of that levelness and quiet that we call equilibrium. Furthermore, when water is heated, it becomes lighter. Should therefore a portion of the sea grow warmer than the remainder, it must and will rise to the surface. And whenever a portion becomes cooled, it must and will sink. Now, under the continuous blazing sun of the torrid zone, the sea water near the surface gets fairly warm, having an average temperature of about 85 degrees along the equator, while in the polar regions, the ocean is always chilled by permanent or floating ice until it is nearly cold enough to freeze. But these masses of warm and cold water cannot remain separate in the universal ocean. The hot tropical flood, continually rising, must flow away somewhere to find its level, and it can flow nowhere except toward the poles, for there the ever-sinking volume of chilled, and therefore heavier water, sucks it in to take its place, while it in turn creeps underneath toward the equator, there to fill the gap which the escaping warm water leaves behind. So we know there is constantly going on an interchange of water, a constant flowing away from the equator, northward and southward on the surface, and a flowing in toward the equator along the bottom, an endless springing up in the torrid zone, and a steady settling down in the polar seas. One out of many proofs of this fact is that the thalassal abysses below the depth of a mile or so are known to be ice cold. This could not happen unless they were constantly filled and refilled with new water from the great coolers at the poles. For if the water at those depths should remain unchanged, it would soon become very warm from the heat of the interior of the earth, whence it does constantly extract some heat. But while this invisible vertical circulation is going on, another more visible and interesting set of movements is in progress on the surface, forming what are known as ocean currents. These are vast rivers in the ocean, flowing across its face in certain directions and to a certain depth, as rivers make their way along the land. They begin and are kept going mainly by a union of the two causes already explained, heat and wind. The heat of the sun at the equator, warming, lightening, and evaporating the air, constantly tends to draw the colder water from the poles, most copiously from the South Pole. But the Antarctic water hastening to the equator is soon interrupted by the extremities of Australia, Africa, and South America, and so split into three great branches. That which passes into the South Atlantic goes on northward along the western coast of Africa, part of it becoming so warm under the hot sun there that it will not sink, but constantly comes more and more to the surface, until it strikes against the great shoulder of Guinea and is turned sharply westward. Now it is squarely under the trade wind and headed the same way. Constantly urged forward by this moderate but endless tugging of the wind upon its waves, the current can never swerve, but flows along the equator and for half a dozen degrees each side of it, straight across the Atlantic. South America, however, stands in its path, and the wedge-like coast of Brazil, pointed with Cape St. Roch, splits this great river. Part of it now turns southward and swings back across toward Africa, making an eddy a couple of 1,000 miles wide in the South Atlantic, while another arm runs down the Patagonian coast. But by far the largest part of the divided current is sent northward, past the coast of Upper Brazil into the Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico, where it is well heated and thence poured into the North Atlantic to become widely celebrated as the Gulf Stream. Gathered in full force, the Gulf Stream flows northward, close along the coast of our southern states, at the rate of 80 or 90 miles a day, until Cape Hatteras gives it a swerve away when it strikes out to sea and pushes straight across to Spain, where a branch leaves it and runs northward between Iceland and the British Isles, while the main body turns southward to mingle again with the equatorial current from Africa and repeat its journey all over again. It is in the heart of this great circle of currents in the middle of the Atlantic that navigators find that dreaded region of heat and calm which they call the doldrums. And here too float round and round the wide, buoyant meadows of the Sargasso Sea. Meanwhile, another most important cold stream is making its way through the Atlantic, known as the Arctic Current. It comes down out of Baffin's Bay, joins a similar flood from the outer coast of Greenland, is thrown up to the surface by the banks of Newfoundland, where meeting warm air, it produces those thick and prolonged fogs so common in that region, fills the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the bight between Nova Scotia and Cape Cod with chilly water, and finally dips under the Gulf Stream, amid that commotion of winds and waters that makes the track of the steamships between New York and Europe the most tempestuous of ocean highways. It is the mingling of these warm and cold waters there which is chiefly responsible for the stormy condition of the North Atlantic. The Pacific has a similar arrangement of circulation north and south of the equator. The Antarctic waters form a cold stream named the Humboldt Current, which pours up the western side of South America, keeping the climate down to a far more wintry condition than it is entitled to by latitude, until it reaches the southern trade winds, which sweep it westward straight across the Pacific, where much of it is lost among the archipelagos of Oceania, and the southern part flows onward into the Indian Ocean. North of the Pacific equator, a similar westward current moves steadily over the great waste of waters past the Sandwich Islands to the coast of China. From the Philippines and Japan northward, however, there is a far stronger flow, known to the Japanese as the Black Current or Kuroshio, which skirts the coast of Japan and the Kurile Islands, makes these and Kamchatka habitable, then turns sharply east along the front of the foggy Aleutian chain of islands, and broadening and cooling as it turns, swings down the temperate coast of Alaska and gradually disappears. These two great currents and their enclosed eddies are far broader and less distinct than those of the North and South Atlantic, but they follow the same laws. In a similar but lesser way, the Indian Ocean has a strong westerly stream flowing straight across from Australia to South Africa, which is of immense help to ships returning from the east around the Cape of Good Hope. From Mozambique, the water turns northward to make the return round. But here it is complicated by the peculiar conditions made by the inflow and outflow of the Red Sea, Arabian Gulf, and so on, and by the disturbing influences of the monsoons until it can hardly be defined. Of all these currents, none is as well marked as the Gulf Stream. Its blue water is in such contrast to the darker greenish hue of the remainder of the ocean that sailors can often tell when they enter the edge of the current, half their vessel being in and half out of the stream. If you approach from the west, you find that the water at first shows a warmth of only 50 or 60 degrees near the surface, but as you sail on, this increases until opposite Sandy Hook, you may get as high a reading on the thermometer as 80 degrees, and opposite Florida above 100 degrees. This difference in temperature between the eastern and western margins of the Gulf Stream is owing to the presence of the great river of Arctic water flowing in an opposite direction between the Gulf Stream and the shore. Off Florida, the Gulf Stream is about 60 miles wide. Off New York, it is over 100 miles in width, but is less sharply defined. Its depth is hard to determine, but certainly amounts to several hundred feet. It is worth remembering that although some guesses had been made at it before, Dr. Benjamin Franklin was the first man to study the Gulf Stream and to tell us anything of its origin and course. The way in which some of these ocean currents affect the weather of the lands upon which they border shows how great is the influence of the sea upon land climates. Indeed, it may be truthfully said that only the continents and such great islands as Australia or Madagascar have any climate essentially distinct from that of the ocean in their quarter of the globe. But the equability that would reign over an ocean of quiet water, determining the amount of cold and heat by regular gradation in latitude between the equator and the poles, is completely upset by the great current movements I have outlined. Scotland, for example, lies as far north as Labrador, and the latitude of London is above that of Lake Superior, yet neither have those terrible frosts and heavy snows which prevail in Canada, and make Labrador a land of ice almost uninhabitable. This difference is due almost wholly to the fact that the Gulf Stream pours its warm flood against the coast of Great Britain, and even tempers the Norwegian coast, keeping Barents's Sea largely free from summer ice, and clothes Spitzbergen with vegetation, although within 10 degrees of the pole. Hence, in the forests of northern Scandinavia, Lapps can dwell in much comfort on a line with the frozen barren grounds north of Hudson Bay. On the other hand, the unfortunate coasts of Greenland are bathed in water chilled by months of captivity near the pole, and loaded with ice that cools down all the winds that blow ashore. Greenland itself is covered with an unbroken sheet of ice, hundreds or thousands of feet thick, yet most of it is no farther north than Sweden. The whole northeastern coast of America down to Labrador is encrusted with ice, and the region south of the St. Lawrence has a similar climate to Finland, while even farther south, Boston, within the protecting arm of Cape Cod, is in winter a city of frost and snow and fog from November till April, when it really is little farther north than sunny Naples, where one laughs at winter. Similarly, in the Pacific Ocean, the northward movement of the great Japanese current makes the coast of China habitable and pleasant clear to the Sea of Okhotsk, gives the Aleutian archipelago a pretty decent climate, and causes the islands and coasts of Alaska and British Columbia to nourish the most magnificent forests in America, and to have a climate resembling that of Great Britain. Glasgow and Sitka are, in fact, in the same latitude, and under very similar climatic conditions, except that in Scotland there are no such lofty and cold mountains to precipitate constant rains as is the case along the northwest margin of America. Similar examples and contrasts might be drawn in other parts of the world. The weather in the interior of continents is pretty much alike on similar latitudes the world round, varying with height. But the climate of all sea coasts is good or bad as a place to live, in accordance with the temperature of the water which the currents bring to that part of the ocean. But the currents of the ocean influence something besides the weather. Upon them depends to a considerable extent whether a certain part of the coast shall have one or another kind of animals dwelling in the salt water. This is not so much true of fishes as it is of the mollusks or shellfish, the worms that live in the mud of the tide flats, the anemones, sea urchins, starfish, and little clinging people of the wet rocks, and of the jellyfishes great and small that swim about in the open sea. Nothing would injure most of these small fry more than a change in the water, making it a few degrees colder or warmer than they were accustomed to, since the constant circulation of the currents keeps the ocean water in all its parts almost precisely of the same density, and food seems about as likely to abound in one district as another. Naturalists have concluded that it is temperature which decides the extent of coast or of sea area where any one kind of invertebrate animal will be found. It thus happens that the life of Cuban waters is different from that of our Carolina coast, and that, again, largely separate from what you will see off New York, while Cape Cod seems to run out as a partition between the shore life south of it and a very different set of shells, sandworms, and so forth, characteristic of the colder waters to the northward. Out in the ocean, however, the warm current of the Gulf Stream forms a genial pathway along which southern swimming animals, like the wondrously beautiful Portuguese man-o'-war, may wander northward for hundreds of miles beyond where they are found near shore. Yet if by chance they stray outside the limits of the warm Gulf Stream, they will at once be chilled to death, as happened once to millions of tilefish. Ocean currents carry floating burdens long distances. They bring the icebergs to form those terrible fogs of Alaska and Newfoundland, and they often bear far away the logs that float out of tropical rivers. These drifting logs often have plants growing upon them, or contain quantities of seeds which are not injured by their short voyages. When, therefore, the coral polyps build up one of their reef islands until it appears above the waves, thither the currents bring roots and seeds from neighboring islands, and quickly plant them upon the new barren shores, so that in a few seasons the little islet becomes green and wooded and ready to hold its own against the winds and waves. Moreover, the same drifting stuff will carry land animals as passengers, insects, snails of many kinds, reptiles, and even four-footed beasts, and so not only give the island a vegetation, but populate it with various of the smaller animals. This seems to you, perhaps, a very accidental and haphazard way of fitting out a country so that presently it may support human beings, nor is it the only means by which barren islands become productive. But it is important as far as it goes, and when we study into the distribution of plants and animals in an archipelago, we are pretty sure to find those of the same sort upon islands that lie in the same current, even to the human inhabitants. Chapter 3: The Building and Rigging of Ships. As late as 1861, an exploring ship was visited by natives of Western Australia, riding simple, rough logs. To smooth and sharpen the log's end, and then to hollow it out, has been thought to be the first step taken by primitive man in his progress toward a boat. But I think the dugout probably came later, or at any rate no earlier than the folding of bark into a trough and tying up the ends, as some people are still content to do. In North America, where materials were favorable, this germ developed into the very highest type of canoe, the Algonquin birch bark. It may have been an attempt to imitate the bark canoe in a more durable form, which led to the laborious hollowing of dugouts. But here again, in regions where suitable trees grew, the art developed so highly as to produce the great sea boats of Papua New Guinea and our northwest coast Indians, carved from a single log, yet able to carry 60 or more persons and their luggage. Such boats as these, when provided with sails, are practically ships and satisfy every need of their owners. Another root of naval architecture lies in the raft, which long ago reached a high degree of usefulness in the sea-going balsa of western South America. It is probable that the South Sea catamaran is a clever outgrowth of experience with a raft. In Polynesia, it took the form of two great canoes, exactly equal, fastened close together and covered by a single central deck. And such are the seaworthiness and speed of these double boats that the Polynesians voyage hundreds of miles in them. Similar in purpose, namely to ensure stability, are the various outriggers that at once characterize and distinguish among themselves the native craft of the South Seas. This device consists of a beam of the lightest obtainable wood, usually about half as long as the canoe, which rests upon the water parallel to and a few feet away from the side of the boat, and is connected with its gunwale by elastic rods or planks. Sometimes these are covered or partly covered by a light platform, and there are many variations in form. But the idea in all cases is to keep the boat from overturning. In many parts of the world, logs could be obtained large enough only for a narrow bottom or hollowed keel, and the remainder of the boat was built up from planks and pieces, ingeniously pegged and knit together with tree nails, rattan, and cords made of vegetable fibers that tightened when wet. The Madras surf boats are a familiar example in civilized waters of boats made in this way, which have great elasticity, and out of them have developed, without much change, the swift prowess of the Malays and the junks of China, Korea, and Japan. One device for stitching these boats firmly together was the leaving of ridges on the inner side of the planks or pieces, through holes in which they could be tied to each other and to the inner framework without making a hole reaching the outside. This system seems to have been earlier than the use of tree nails. Of similar construction, apparently, were the boats of the Egyptians and other peoples about the eastern end of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, which, as far back as 3,000 years before Christ, had reached the size and capabilities of true ships, making, as we shall presently see, extensive sea voyages. Pictures of them remain in the very ancient tombs and show that the planking consisted of pieces about 3 feet square, which were laid on overlapping like shingles on a roof and fastened to the framework by wooden tree nails. The Phoenicians and their pupils, the Greeks and Romans, improved on these methods in various ways, at last substituting iron, copper, and bronze nails or bolts which would not rust for the wooden pegs of their ancestors. All of these boats and those of all Western Europe, of which the best outside the Mediterranean were the Viking ships, differed in one essential point of construction from Oriental ships. Instead of making the shell of the vessel and fitting into it a framework of connected braces, as the Malays and Polynesians did and yet do, they laid a keel, bending it up or setting into it stem and stern posts at the end, and inserted along its sides curving upright timbers, well-styled ribs, which swelled out amidships and narrowed in forward and aft, making a skeleton of the shape the hull was intended to be. Finally, over and upon this well-braced framework were securely fastened the planks, which were narrow and ran lengthwise in every case except that of the ancient Nile boats. The Scandinavian Vikings developed a craft of their own, one of the most interesting of the ancient ships, and to these northern craftsmen is traceable the principal influence that has shaped British, and consequently American, shipbuilding and seamanship. This early Scandinavian boat was always made of oak, sharp at both ends and rather shallow, the general form being much like that of a modern whaleboat with a great rounding keel, if indeed this wonderful sea craft may not be a lineal descendant of the Viking ship. The hewn planks were attached to the keel and to the ribs, usually single, naturally bent, V-shaped prongs of oak, in a most ingenious and serviceable manner, and they were always overlapping, or clinker or clencher built. Several of these and other prehistoric boats have been found buried in peat moss and in mounds in Germany, Denmark and Scandinavia, and have been described by various writers. The motive power of all the early boats was found in human arms, wielding paddles or oars. It is said that the oldest forms of paddles of which we have any record among the Egyptian or Assyrian hieroglyphs show them to have been shaped somewhat like the arm and hand, and that similar paddles were to be seen a few decades ago on the canals in Holland. This is natural, because undoubtedly the first paddle ever used was the naked hand. Short paddles were soon found less powerful than long ones, but in order to work the latter, it was necessary to brace them against something in the middle. Notches were therefore cut in the edge of the boat, or thole pins were inserted. The paddle became an oar, and by boatmen learned the art of feathering and so forth. Steering could be done of old as now, with a turn of the rearmost paddle in a canoe, and as canoes enlarged, the steering paddle was lengthened. As the sterns of the ancient boats were usually either sharp like the prows, or else built up into an ornamental height, the most convenient place for the steering oar was over the right side, where it was balanced in a loop of cable or otherwise, as close to the after end of the boat as practicable, and then a crosspiece extended inboard from the handle, enabling the steersman to move it more easily by giving him the benefit of leverage. Such was the arrangement of steering gear in all the ancient Mediterranean boats, and it is to a similar arrangement in the sea-going craft of our northern ancestors that we owe our words stern and starboard, which originally meant steering place and steering side. The modern rudder is substantially the same oar set upright, tiller and all, and hinged to the stern post. In fact, the word has descended from the old Teutonic name for oar, and all gradations between steering oar and true rudder may still be found. Though some romantic stories are told by the old mythologists as to its origin, the idea of rigging was as natural and practical in its development as that of hull or steering gear. That a strong breeze moves a canoe, and that if a man in a canoe holds his robe outstretched, or a thick bush upright, the force will send him along without the labor of paddling, and lengthwise rather than sidewise, because that is the direction of least resistance, were facts quickly and gratefully seized upon by the earliest boatmen. To have a skin ready for the purpose, and to set up a pole and ropes to hold it in position, were easy matters. Yet in this simple arrangement you have the first sail. But skins were too heavy and valuable for such a purpose, except in such limited circumstances as those in the Arctic. Persons who spent much time on the water, therefore, like the most ancient Egyptians and the islanders of the Chinese and South Seas, soon devised a way of weaving rushes or splints of bamboo into broad mats, and thus were able, on account of their lightness, to carry much larger and more effective sails, which were kept outstretched by one or more cross poles or spars, and could be taken down quickly. Many such sails are in use to this day, not only among Asiatic and African boatmen, but on the northwest coast of Canada. A fine example hangs above my desk as I write. with the discovery of how to make cloth and cordage of woolen, silken, hempen, and cotton fibers, and in Egypt of papyrus, came a still better material for ropes and sails. Since cloth was so much lighter that a far greater extent of it could be spread than before, its flexibility enabled it to be handled, changed, and rolled up snugly, and its cheapness encouraged its use and the practice of navigation generally. We read of silken sails on the royal barges of medieval times, but they could hardly have exceeded in strength or elegance those of the fine Phoenician ships that carried the commerce of the world 25 centuries ago. Fine linen with broidered work from Egypt was that which thou spreadest forth to be thy sail, exclaims the sacred chronicler Ezekiel. Hempen cloth indeed was preferred for sails until the present century, as is expressed in our word canvas, which is derived from the Latin name of flax. But now cotton has mainly superseded it. Anciently, the sails were often colored, purple or vermilion being the badge of a monarch or an admiral. Black denoted mourning. In some cases, the topsail seems to have been colored, while the sail below was plain, and frequently a patchwork of colors was produced by using different stuffs. Various inscriptions and devices were also woven or painted on the sails, sometimes in gold. The Venetians and Greeks do the same to this day, adding a gaudy feature to the lovely Levantine sea scenery. And the sails of the North Sea fishermen are turned to a rich red and yellow by the tanning mixture in which they soak their canvas. And that's as good a place as any to end this evening's reading from the Book of the Ocean. Once again, I find myself impressed by Mr. Ingersoll's ability to explain some pretty complex topics in such clear ways. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com, or catch me on Twitter at boringbookspod. I always love hearing from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.